Good evening, everyone. My name is Victoria Matthews, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event discussing the book Lines to the Horizon, Australian Surf Writing with Mark Smith and Jock Sarong. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the land on which their library service operates. They pay their respects to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders, past, present and emerging. They acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. This session was actually meant to be originally held at the Australian National Surfing Museum, but due to COVID and capacity changes, we've been obliged to move this event online. But I did just want to thank the museum for being willing to help out. And because we're not surrounded by the artefacts at the moment, I just wanted to mention their current exhibition. That's Waves and Wheels. This exhibition explores the relationship between surfers and their cars from the 1950s to the 1980s. And it features an interactive panel van experience, something my father warned me against all the way through the 80s. I hope you all get a chance to check it out. I think it speaks to all of us in that cultural way. Thank you for joining us tonight. Just some brief housekeeping reminders before we begin our discussion. You can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button and typing in your questions or comment. Please feel free to do that anytime, and Jock and Mark will get to those at some point. If you're using an iPad or iPhone, you may need to touch your screen to bring up that function. Also, just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to watch this discussion again or let your friends and family know, you'll be able to watch it on the library's YouTube channel over the next couple of days. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Mark Smith and Jock Sarong. Mark lives in Victoria's West Coast and has surfed for 45 years. His debut novel, The Road to Winter, was shortlisted for multiple awards and is taught in schools around Australia. The sequel, Wilder Country, won the 2018 Australian Indie Award for YA. The third book in the trilogy, Land of the Fences, was published in 2019. Mark is also an award-winning writer of short stories, with credits including Jocelyn Urich's Literary Prize and the Alan Marshall Short Story Prize, and his work has appeared in the Best Australian Short Stories, Review of Australian Fiction, The Big Issue, The Victorian Writer and The Australian. And in between all of that, he's managed very recently to publish his new book, If Not Us. Jock Serong is the author of 5 novels spanning crime, thriller and historical fiction. He's also the editor of the Great Ocean Quarterly and has written extensively for magazines and other media. And he's an international, he's internationally known, including Surfing World. You write for Surfing World, is that right, Jock? Yes.
I do.
Monthly, Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, Culture Mag, and lots more. Jock lives in Port Fairy and is currently completing his final instalment of historical trilogy about the Furneaux Islands in Bass Strait. Tonight, Mark and Jock will discuss Lines to the Horizon and the importance of a literary culture around surfing. Welcome, Mark and Jock.
Thanks, Vic.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Vic, and welcome everybody. Welcome, Jock.
G'day, Mark. Really been surfing for 45 years.
I have been surfing for 45 years, and what they didn't add there was that my boards just kept getting wider and longer as my shoulders get stiffer and stiffer. Just so we're all on the same page here, Lines to the Horizon is a collection of stories and a collection of essays from writers from around Australia. And while I'm one of those writers and Jock wrote the foreword, I really want to acknowledge the other writers who have magnificent pieces in this anthology as well. So they are Sally Breen, Emily Brugman, Sam Carmody, Madeline Dickey, and Jake Santner. So I naturally highly recommend it. We're going to be talking a little bit about how the anthology came together, and that's where I really want to begin, because when these pieces were all in manuscript form, we were looking for someone to write a foreword for us, and Jock, you were approached. What were your first impressions when you received these stories and you were asked to write your foreword?
Yeah, it's a good kicking off point, Mark. I remember being really intrigued about it, and actually later in the process, when the PDF of the cover came through, the thing that really interested me was that there's no blue in that cover. And indeed, there are no illustrations in the book. And I think that is quite a deliberate statement, I imagine, by Fremantle Press, that this was an exercise in talking about the culture and not in doing the usual things that surfing media does. And I was really struck by, I guess what I look for is there a diversity of voices? And by that, I don't mean diversity in the currently controversial sense. I mean simply a diversity in the sense of looking at surfing from different angles. And that's the thing that really stood out, that here's a collection of 6 stories that are about entirely different views of what we do. All the way down to, is it even a sport? Is it a culture? This is a thing I think I might have talked about in the foreword, that to each and every one of us, it's an entirely different activity that we're taking on. And it was immediately apparent that 6 people had taken 6 entirely personal perspectives on the activity.
It was a pretty broad remit that we were given as writers. It was fantastic to be approached to write it, to write for the anthology, but it was basically pitched to us because I think the anthology began with Jake Sadner's piece on Taj Burrow and his final heat in a contest in the WSL, and I think they had this fantastic piece of writing, probably a little bit too small to be published on its own. And I know Jake is with us tonight, so welcome, Jake. I think they sort of fished around and looked for writers who had surfing either in their fiction or non-fiction, and they basically said, "What do you want to write about?" Which is a pretty amazing thing as a writer to get that. In some ways, it's a little bit harder because it can be easier to have a narrower topic.
Well, I mean, starting with you've written what I guess is biography, and then Jake has written what I would consider to be very, very close quarters sport writing. And Sally's written sociology. There's memoir in there between Emily and Madeline. All of these different approaches, it's just fascinating that in one sense we're all talking about the same thing, but we really aren't.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a reflection of what Fremantle were trying to do with this collection, was to try and make it as broad as possible. But it was a great opportunity too to bring something of ourselves and our relationship with surfing and our relationship as writers. So I know with mine, I sort of vacillated for a while. I wasn't sure why I was going to do it on, but I've always been fascinated by this idea of the way in which people's, I suppose, connection, their relationship with the ocean, and how that influences their daily lives. And in this case, I chose 3 artists. So when I say artists, I had Mick Sowry, who is a photographer and filmmaker who you know well as from working on with Great Ocean Quarterly. I had Fable Parrott, the writer, who everybody I think would be aware of. And I had Jeff Raglas, musician and painter. And I guess one of the things I really liked about this piece when I wrote it, when I was putting it together, was they actually changed through the interviews that I did with them. My ideas actually changed about what their relationship might be. And it was very interesting to sort of dig into that and to find out. And most of them were basically, in fact, all 3 of them were saying that that it was an influence on what they did, but it wasn't necessarily the driver on what they did.
I'm thinking about working with Mick when you say it changed. Mick notoriously will ring up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, I was thinking about what we were talking about. And I don't think I quite nailed what I meant. I've got this other idea. Yeah. And off you go. I imagine that's what you got.
Yeah, well, obviously, I once I had a reasonable draft, I took it back to the three people that I was that I'd been interviewing. They all had, I must say, Mick probably had the most input back again, and Fable and Jeff, you know, a little bit just getting the facts right. But the one thing that I did, because I'm basically a fiction writer, I'm not necessarily a non-fiction writer. I've written some non-fiction, but to bang out a 10,000 word piece is a very different thing.
The difference for me, sorry, the difference in looking at what you wrote here compared to, I've read all of your novels and indeed a lot of your short stuff, is that it feels to me like in your fiction, you use the surfing as part of the furniture, that there are dramas between characters and there are issues to sort out. And the surfing is something that happens along the way, where here you actually had to turn your gaze fully to the culture.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I think that's pretty true. I think I'm very big believer in that, you know, writing from your own experience, and I think that something like surfing, when it's used in fiction, can work as a metaphor for lots of other things that are going on in the story as well. And that's what I try to use. But in writing non-fiction, I find it so much harder than writing fiction. Basically, because fiction, you can just make stuff up. Whereas with non-fiction, as you know, and I want to talk about your surf journalism in a minute, as you know, you've got to check and double check again before anything goes to print. Can you tell us a little bit of your history in surf journalism? And I'm really interested in the way that has kind of morphed into fiction writing.
Yeah, well, I think when I first started trying to write surfing stuff, this was about probably 06, 07. And I feel like I had that experience of turning up at a party just after the cops had gone through the place, because all of a sudden the great surf journalism careers were kind of coming to a close, and it was getting harder and harder to travel the globe as a surf journalist, and nobody had expense accounts anymore, and it seemed like the fun had suddenly vanished just as I turned up. But I started off, I had this story that I wrote about a trip I did to Madeira in the Atlantic, and it was the twin terrors of surfing this big wave and proposing to Lily. And I don't know which one I was more scared of. And every day I'd wake up and contemplate both and just start drinking. And it took days and days of these terrors to resolve both issues. So I wrote this story, which in fact has never been published anywhere, despite my efforts. I sent it to Tracks, I think. And then I discovered that I've got a neighbour, literally a drop punt away, Keith Curtin, who published Australian Surf Business. And Keithy was happy to have me write little business stories for him about surfing. So profiles of surf shops and surf executives and a bit of market stuff. And then that led to Surfing World. And Surfing World was where I got to really stretch out, because at that stage, they were taking stories, and to their eternal credit, you know, stories that I'd meander around for 6,000 or 7,000 words. And I was talking about things like coral biology or mental health or Indigenous claims to the coastline. And they actually encouraged that stuff. So I was on this mission where I felt like I was trying to push as hard as I could at what could be a surfing story. Because I was never ever going to be any good at talking about who had the best cutback or what happened in the quarterfinals at Bells. That's just sort of not what I do. And they were very tolerant of that, and they gave me lots and lots of rope. And so those were a lot of really good years doing that work. It never spread very far beyond Surfing World, and indeed I still write features for Surfing World. But what it did do was it gave me just enough confidence to start thinking about writing little bits of fiction. Got in a writing group here in Port Fairy, and we exchanged bits of fiction, and I think at some stage I worked out that all the little fragments were in fact pieces of one story, and I was able to build a novel. So all of that was very gradual, and it was very instinctive. I wasn't talking to anyone about how to do it. I wasn't aware of the courses that you could do or the groups that you could join other than my little writers group. And I was just really feeling my way into it. And I suppose that means that I made a lot of my mistakes actually in print.
Yeah. We've talked, I know, together about this kind of idea about the way the reporting or the stories or I guess the literary culture around surfing has been changed enormously in the last probably 20 years or so, particularly in terms of that idea that it always relied on. When I was growing up, I began surfing in I'm embarrassed to say, in the 1970s or so.
You predate the thruster.
And what was available then was the sort of magazines, Tracks, Surfing World, magazines like that would come out on a monthly basis. And, you know, you go down to the newsagent, and I probably didn't always pay for it, but you get hold of a copy anyway. And that was, we would see then photographs from you know, Hawaii that summer. And that's a very, very different experience from what we have now in the way that surfing is reported, because I can sit here at my desk and I can beam into a WSL event anywhere in the world, and I can see drone footage, and I can see surfers being interviewed off jet skis. You know, what does that do in terms of writing around surfing? How does that change the culture of what writing around surfing is?
I think that what it does is that the discussion of any culture is always going to be a balance of experience and contemplation. So if you want to talk about Test cricket, the experience is watching people standing on a field, and it's reasonably slow moving, and accordingly you do a lot of talking about statistics and backstory and stuff. Football's a bit the same, because football is so intensely statistical. So there's spreads of numbers coming up all the time, and people can tell a story through the numbers. Surfing, we used to do a lot of the navel gazing stuff, the contemplation stuff. And it meant that in the 90s, I think the 90s were the high point of this, when the written culture was ascendant, and you had people like Derek Hind raging against the establishment, and you had Nick Carroll and Phil Jarrett, and these writers who had lots of room and lots of strong opinions, and they knew what they were talking about. And so the surfing got analysed to the nth degree, and the culture got analysed. People like Tim Baker and Andrew Kidman wrote stories about surfing's position in society. As the experience has now become ascendant through, as things you mentioned, like GoPros and drones and just the existence of social media, we're able to experience surfing in a very, very immediate sense, but it means that the contemplating of it has fallen into the background. And the written culture around surfing, I think, is currently at low ebb. And I'm not lamenting that, because the experience is absolutely astounding. The quality of what we can see from our desk is just amazing. But it means that if you're an adjective slinger, you're kind of in the back seats now. And I think that tends us towards a sporting understanding of surfing rather than a cultural understanding of surfing. And maybe that's the downside of it.
Yeah, it does bring to mind for me Jake's piece in the anthology, which basically deals with Taj Burrow's final heat on the WSL circuit at Cloudbreak in Fiji. But it's not just a description of the heat. It's almost Jake almost brings himself into the first person as Taj, waking up in the morning, you know, as he works his way through the heats, and of course he ends up in this heat with John Florence at Cloudbreak, beautiful wave, and John basically surfs the best. I should say Taj actually surfs the best heat he can possibly surf. You know, he doesn't think he's got that much more. He makes one tiny little error towards the end, and John. Now, I remember watching that. This is where we're getting to. I remember watching that heat live and seeing it, and just being transfixed by what was going on in the water. But you're right, it was entirely visual. There was a little bit of analysis from the commentators, but it was about particular moves that they were making, or particular cutback, or how long he was covered up, or things like that. What I loved about Jake's piece was that it looked behind the curtain, no pun intended, but looking behind the curtain at where Taj was, what was going on in his life, what his obligations were back at home with young children. And it was, I loved that sort of, that description of it in a way that wasn't just the sport, but it was about what was actually going on in the lives of these people as well.
It reminded me in a weird way of good boxing writing. And in particular, I was thinking about Norman Mailer's book, The Fight, about the rumble in the jungle, that what you get to see by that extraordinary feat that Jake has pulled off of imagining someone's mind in that situation, you have this sense of the kind of epic tragedy of the fading hero and the young up and comer and the one punch that comes from nowhere that he fails to see. The tiny moments that actually affect these huge arcs in people's lives. And there's a real physicality about that writing, that he talks about people's bodies and how they're responding in the water, and it was very, very convincing.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here, so I just want to watch the look in your eyes.
Look at the script.
I'd also really like to talk about the piece that opens the anthology, and that's Madeline Dickey's piece about traveling and surfing in Mexico. And it makes that real link between the culture of the countries that we go into as surfers, and for the beautiful piece that it is, there's not an actual lot of description about what takes place in the water. It's more about the journey itself. It's about the culture that she comes in contact with. And I just noticed in the questions that Madeline's with us tonight, which is fantastic. I guess I'm just talking about that idea of the way in which surfing is a journey. It's often linked to a journey. We've all done the road trips. And I was really interested in the introduction that Vic was talking about at the beginning about the exhibition that the Surf Museum has on in Torquay, and that link with cars and that link with, it's one thing that Mick Sowry brings up in the piece that when I was able to interview him, and he talked about his surfing experiences as about the journey. And even though that journey was just from suburban Melbourne down to the East Coast or down to the West Coast, he would find a slow way that he could drive, places that he could stop along the way. And so it was about the journey. We all got our journey stories, but I think that it kind of places surfing in a context as well.
There was a video that the WSL ran, I'm trying to think when this was, I reckon 6 months ago, about a famous heavy wave surfer, and I've lost his name, but he goes with a bunch of people and cameramen and jet skis and God knows what to Morocco, and they surf this extraordinary right-hander, and he gets cleaned up and very, very badly injured, and they have to evacuate him. And what really struck me about the video was that it was beautifully shot and edited. And it was gruesome when he went down, and there was lots of hospital stuff. But it was a video of two halves. The first half was, isn't this place amazing? How lovely are these people? How incredible is that wave? We're so fortunate to be doing this. The second half, once he was hurt, was, get me the hell out of this shithole. And it suddenly struck me that we can be extremely cavalier about the places that we pass through as surfers. And this is going back to the idea of the struggle between analysis and experience. If you took the stills or if you took the footage from that incident, it's extraordinary and spectacular and violent and breathtaking. But if you stop and ask some questions about the privileged people passing through what is essentially a developing country and the way in which they behave when they're there, then maybe that's what the written word does, is you can stop, as happens in Madeline's story, you can stop and contemplate the dangers and the fears and the agendas of the people around you and get a better rounded perspective about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd also like to mention too, something that you brought up in your foreword that you wrote, and that's the paucity of female surf writers in the lexicon. Even though you mentioned the female surfing pioneers that we've had in this country, right back to Pam Burridge and Jodie Cooper and Pauline Mensah, right through to the world champions, through Lane Beachley and Steph Gilmore, obviously, and Tyler Wright. Why has that not been reflected in the written part of surf journalism, do you think?
I think it reflects just how intensely male it's been, what a boys' club it's been. When I took the kids to see Girls Can't Surf, and what struck me about that film was that the talking heads that they had, the people you've mentioned, Jodie Cooper, Pauline Mensah, not only were they really insightful and articulate, they were hysterically funny about the stuff they had to put up with, and remarkably not as bitter as perhaps they're entitled to be. And what it makes you think is, what have we missed out on as an Australian sporting culture? The entirely different set of voices we could have been listening to over all those years that we just didn't hear from. And I don't have any better answer than to say that that's a product of the times and the blokiness.
Yeah. It's one thing that we had the opportunity to talk about this book at Margaret River Writers Festival with Tim Baker. And it's one of the things that we talked about was one of the most significant changes that's happened in surfing in this country in the last 15 to 20 years has been women in the water, women surfing. As you said, it was when I grew up, it was in the 70s and 80s and probably into the 90s as well. It was totally male dominated. Now my local breaks down here on the West Coast, I go out into the water and it's not unusual to have a 50-50 split. I think that changes the dynamic of what happens in the water as well, of the way in which people surf. I think it's been one of the best things that's happened in surfing in my lifetime.
One of the things that's interesting about that, Mark, I reckon, is that if you look at the historical shift from skateboarding into, well, actually it was surfing into skateboarding, but the shift between them in the 70s, in particular, if you look at Dogtown and Z-Boys and films like that, the footage of kids skateboarding in Los Angeles in those stormwater culverts and empty pools and things was literally 50-50 male and female. So in the interchange between the two cultures, between skating and surfing, something got lost along the way. And I don't know what that is at all, but it's a distinctly different looking scene.
Yeah. A couple of other things that sort of I think are brought up through the anthology. I'm interested in if we move from non-fiction to fiction, who are the Australian writers who you think do that well, and how does it work? I mean, and why does it work well when it does?
Yeah, well, I think, the starting point for everybody is always Winton and breath. And I said in the introduction that my mum said to me that she finally got an understanding of what my brothers and I were on about, and that I didn't think she was talking about autoerotic asphyxiation. But I think it was the great success in translating some of these experiences to a non-surfing audience, which has always been the great struggle, hasn't it? And when I started writing on the Java Ridge, I started writing this little scene of a girl surfing, and I wanted to think about the physics of the wave. And I had a fair idea the whole time that it wasn't going to work, because I'm not a great believer in writing fiction about surfing. I just think it's so hard. But yeah, that's been the battle for all of us, hasn't it? And Fiona Cap did it really well in that oceanic feeling when was that? I reckon about 2013. There's been female writers that have come through Great Ocean who've written surfing really well. Finnegan's Barbarian Days, I know it's not Australian, and indeed it's not fiction, it's memoir, but again, a great success in describing the experience to a wider audience, the desperate quest for the crossover. And you see it a lot on screen as well, that films like, I always felt like The Documentary was a great film about a human being and their life, and not so much although the surfing's great. And then there was Bra Boys was the one that the Australian film industry held this great hope that it was going to be the crossover hit, because it's about gangs. And so I think there's definitely audience interest in conveying the experience, but we haven't necessarily hit it all that well yet.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we are, you know, that white Australians, who've principally been, you know, occupying the coastal fringes of this country. So much of our what's in of our literary canon, I suppose, is around that idea of being on the coast, around the beach,
Yes.
but somehow that hasn't translated into surfing, and that being, so I suppose, brought into that fictional world. I know there are people that do it well, and obviously you mentioned Winton as the standard bearer. I think one of the reasons being it is so, as you say, when you're talking about writing Java Ridge, it is so hard to write. Yes. Because there is so much. I wonder whether it's the same with someone who is intensely passionate about something and they bring that into their fiction, whatever it is, because there is so much assumed knowledge that you have. Yes. About how you move, how a body moves in that space, what it feels like, and how it impacts on you as a human being when you're doing it. But to bring that to someone, well, what you've got to do is balance it between people who will know exactly what you're talking about, because they have experienced it for themselves, and those who have never surfed before, but you want to bring into that space. And I think it is one of the great triumphs of Breath is that he manages to do that. And there's some pretty unique experiences that he translates there. I think, you know, he does translate them. And the hold downs are a really good example of that.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah.
So it should be easier because you know that experience so well. But in actual fact, it becomes harder. I know that I've had ongoing battles with my editor in probably 2 or 3 of my books. We're just saying, just pull back on the jargon. We pull back on the jargon. I don't understand what that is, and yet some of that jargon is where the authenticity comes from as well in the writing. So,
and if I try to imagine that phenomenon from the outside, I think about, there was a novel in the 70s called This Sporting Life by David Storey, which was about rugby, and forgive me, I don't know which variety, but I suspect it was league, in Wales, in a coal mining town. And the author clearly knew precisely what he was talking about in terms of the physical experiences of being munched in some hideous scrum by these huge coal miners. And he successfully got it across to me, who has never and will never experience that physicality. It's exactly the same thing done from the other end, and you can see just how hard it is to get that thing across convincingly. I mean, there's been one interesting work of fiction about Aussie rules football, and that's The Club. And really, that was sociological anyway. It wasn't about the action. Who else has written successful fiction about footy? I don't think anyone.
Yeah. Can I just encourage people? We're about 5 minutes away from taking some questions from you. So we've already got a couple in there. Make sure you put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, or even comments on what Jock and I have been rabbiting on about here, please feel free to throw them in there. So I guess it kind of leads to a question that what is it that elevates good writing when we're talking about something like, I suppose it doesn't necessarily have to be surfing, but something that we are passionate about? What is it that elevates it to a point where we recognise it as being good writing, fiction or non-fiction, as opposed to I suppose, the stereotypes that could be part of it?
Yeah, I think you make the important point that it is about avoiding the stereotypes. I think there are 2 things. One is to find the universality of the experience in new language. So to avoid the accepted labels for things, and to find new bridges of analogy and metaphor and simile to get the experience across to somebody. I think that's a vital thing. And the other is just probably control of language and not allowing it to run off on you. Such difficult things to do, and difficult to know when you've got them right.
Yeah. I was really interested in when I was interviewing Fable Parrott for the piece that I wrote, and she talked about that. She basically said that, you know, her first novel, Past the Shallows, magnificent piece of work, and she she basically said to me that she did not think she could have written that had she not been a surfer herself.
Yeah.
Because what she did for those 3 boys in the family who found refuge in the sea, that's what she felt herself. So what she said was it gave her the language of
Yep.
the water, that then she was able to. And it's not a by any means, it's not a novel about surfing or even surfers. It's a novel about this family and you know what's happened within that family.
Yeah, you remind me too, I think, of another aspect of this, and this applies to all fiction writing, that there's a balance to strike between describing things and leaving room for the reader to imagine them. And if you're describing something that the reader hasn't done, that becomes exceedingly difficult. And so if I'm putting a brown dog in my novel, I might tell you that the brown dog has coarse fur or that it has a shiny nose, but there's no point me describing the brown dog down to the nth degree, because you, as the intelligent reader, want to have the liberty to have your own brown dog. And the same thing applies with describing a wave or describing a lineup from the shore or describing a surfing trip. That you need to credit your reader with the intelligence that they're going to do some inventing of their own and not overcook all the exposition.
Yeah, sure. We've got a few questions that are starting to roll in. Thank you, and keep them coming. So, as I mentioned, we've got 2 of our contributors with us tonight, Madeline Dickey and Jake Sadner. So Madeline has asked the question. I'm going to ask this of you, Jock. So,
is that fair?
You say you have a good and productive balance between your surf addiction and your writing addiction, or does one suffer in favour of the other? That's a great question.
Wouldn't we all answer this the same way, that they're entirely complementary?
Yeah.
Today has been dead flat here. I imagine it probably was where you are as well. And as a result, I sort of did my early lap and established that it was dead flat and it was showing no sign of redeeming itself. And so I sat at the desk completely happy and worked all day productively. If I had known that it was happening out there and that I was missing it, I'd be really tetchy and it would distract me from my work. But I think in the aggregate, and maybe it's just a product of the climate here, I don't know, but in the aggregate, there are enough crappy days and enough good days that I'm getting enough exercise to stay alive, and I'm also getting things done. If I lived somewhere where the surf was more regularly good, I might be in bother.
Yeah.
But if you can arrange your day and your timetable around the 2 things just ebbing and flowing, isn't that just the best thing ever?
It is, especially given that writing is such a solitary thing, and we can't do it on the beach. We've got to do it somewhere separate. So today I was exactly the same. I had 4 presentations that I was doing to a school, and but of course I went, I checked the wind first, and I can go to the end of the street and see what the swell's like. I can have a look, and it was that sense of relief. Oh, great, it's not on today. That's fine.
Yeah,
I can throw myself into these presentations, and like you, I could get some work done this afternoon as well. Do the massive amount of preparation that we've obviously both done for tonight, and do it quite comfortably. But it is very difficult, and call it FOMO or call what you like, but to balance that, to balance the writing and the urge to be, for me, it's an urge to be outdoors as much as to be in the water. And it's a very delicate balance to try and, to strike. So, there's a question from Jake as well. So, loving the discussion, thank you. While you're on the topic, I was wondering what your opinions were on surf fiction's role in surfing culture. As a genre, we've been writing about surfing fiction for almost 200 years. Why do you think we write about surfing, and what are we trying to achieve?
Oh, gee, there's a bit in that.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Jake, for that immovable object.
Yeah.
But it's a good one. I tend to think that we are trying to fix the ineffable, that we're never ever going to get to a satisfactory resolution about surfing in fiction. And indeed, fiction is not for every surfer. But given that it preoccupies so much of our time, I suppose we feel obliged to explore it as you know, if you go back to the 60s, it's easier to say that surfers were a particular kind of person. There weren't that many of them, and they had a very tribal look and sound about them. That no longer applies because surfers are now so numerous and so diverse that you can't draw a line through them. So it means that, you know, when I said before about surfing being part of the furniture in your fiction, Mark, I guess it's like writing a novel after the pandemic. Suddenly you have to explore things like face masks and social distancing and Q codes. There are so many surfers in society that in writing about society, you almost inevitably wind up writing about surfing in some way. It's a thing that 3 million Australians do. And so it becomes part of the stage setting. And that's if you're not focusing on it as the driving force of your fiction. And a lot of the time we aren't. It's part of the scenery.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. As for what we're trying to achieve, it is a reflection of part of our culture, of what is a large part of our culture for a lot of people. We talk about the force of numbers now, and I brought this into my reflections about living on the west coast here of Victoria for the last 30 odd years, and I've seen enormous change in that time. Not so much, obviously, not so much in the physical landscape, although now we tend to look after our beaches and our beach environments a lot in a lot more respectful way than we did when we're driving our cars to the top of the cliff at Winky or Boobs or somewhere, in the 1980s. So that's changed, but the force of numbers and the number of people now, the volume of people who are turning surfing into something that I haven't seen it before in my lifetime, and it's just the number of people in the water. It is the way in which we work around that or we don't work around it. And it's never going to go back. I do have those conversations with other older surfers on the beach that, and this kind of sort of moves into our next question as well about, nostalgia around surfing, and whether it was better in the 1980s, or whether, with the equipment that we have now, and the access to surfing from all over the world, without a pandemic, the ability to travel, all of those sorts of things, it is hard to avoid that nostalgia in surfing.
I think, that takes things in an interesting direction because, excuse me, I think one of the things that surfing fiction does is it's an escape from inauthenticity. We all get really tired of being fed corporate nonsense and sporting jargon, and so we try to retreat into a place where surfing feels real again, and fiction is a great way of doing that. And I remember a few years ago I was sent on a trip to Tasmania with a sponsor and their sponsored surfers, and the idea was that we were going to get lots of photographs and make it look really real, all these guys. The fact was they were all wearing the same clothes and the same wetsuits, and they had the same boards because they were a team. And I was being paid to do it, so I shouldn't have been so ungrateful, but I really railed against it. And what I wound up doing was writing a fictional story around the photographs about us searching for this fabled Tasmanian surfing pioneer who had disappeared on the west coast. And I gave him a name, and I had maps, and there were photographs that I'd pinched off the wall at the pub. And the whole thing was completely and utterly untrue. But in the end, the publishers were really interested and said, do you want to do more exploration about this guy and what happened to him? And I said, no, I don't, because I made him up. He doesn't exist. But I think that was me searching for, can we find something that feels a little bit more real by making it up, as ironic as that is?
Yeah. It's interesting that the Tasmanian connection, Mick Sowry made a film down on King Island called Musica Surfica, where he involved the Australian Chamber Orchestra and Richard Tognetti, who is the conductor of the orchestra, but also a very keen surfer. And he, in about 2007, I think he took a film crew down there, some incredible mix of surfers, largely riding finless boards in this very, very isolated location, and yet came up with something which is, I think, a really powerful film, a really interesting film. And whether that was pulling on nostalgia for what we had lost, for just a group of people being able to surf together, or whether he was, and maybe as a reflection on what's going on with surfing in the rest of the world. And it also became a live performance as well.
And I think more than nostalgia, I think it's a species of defiance. That's a filmmaker saying, surfing might not look like this all the time at the moment, but I really wish it did, and somewhere it does. It's a lot like what Litmus did. If it wasn't for Litmus and Musica Surfica around that period, we would have had a very, very different visual culture around Australian surfing, because it was otherwise, in the early Kelly Slater years, people with super long board shorts and these crappy narrow boards, it was a pretty arid place. And here were these filmmakers offering a vision that felt really earthy and good. I think that's kind of an act of subversion in a way.
Yeah. And of course, Mick went on to make 2 versions of the Reef as well, which was filmed up in Western Australia, northern Western Australia, on the edge of Ningaloo Reef. Stunning, and again, bringing music and surfing together. And I encourage anyone watching tonight or listening in tonight to go see if you can find the Reef was designed as a performance piece that could be performed live, and I was lucky enough to see it at Hamer Hall. So the visuals were playing behind the chamber orchestra while the chamber orchestra was playing, and it involved the Pigram brothers as well. I guess it's a concept film as much as anything else.
Yeah.
What I want to ask you about too, Jock, is, and this is that obviously came from your surfing journalism, but you set up a venture called Great Ocean Quarterly. What were you aiming to do there? And I guess the tough question is, why didn't it work?
Well, the easier thing is what we were trying to do, which was that, going back to the idea that when I have written surfing media articles, I've tried to push at the boundaries of what a surfing story is. I think Mick has done a similar thing with his filmmaking, and Mark Willett, who is our third partner, has the same ideas about surfing. And we were interested to know, if you take surfers and sailors and fishermen and bird watchers and all of these people who hang around the coastlines, in each instance, the common ground is that they have some surface level reason for being there, but underneath there's a deeper pull, that all of us perhaps are reaching for a similar thing, but we've just got a different label on it at the top. Sailing yachts, doing whatever we're doing. And we wanted to see whether there was a commonality of spirit across all of those different people. And I suppose that a thread here is conservation and being worried for the coast. But we felt like you could talk to someone who fishes about someone who collects plastic off the beach. You could talk to someone who surfs about someone who free dives, because of those commonalities that we thought were there. What went wrong was pretty clearly, I think, that at every step of the process, we made Rolls-Royce decisions. So I remember vividly, there was a day when we were showing all the printers paper samples, and we all went, oh, yes, we'll have that one, thank you, yes. And it was the one that cost about 8 times as much to post. So I think it got to a point where the more copies we sold, the more money we lost. So we really needed some kind of billionaire philanthropist to come down in a helicopter and bankroll us, and that moment never arrived. We've had heaps and heaps of fun with it, and we did our dough at one point, but we paid everybody. And we put one out last year that actually went well, and it made a little bit of money, and I think we'll do it again next year. And perhaps what we'll do is treat them as special projects along the way into the future.
Yeah, they were stunning. They were stunning magazines. They were coffee table magazines, really.
Oh, no expense spared.
I've just got a comment here that's come on in the Q&A section from Madeline. Again, when we're talking about surf travel, so she's got a comment here that's from Nick Carroll, and I'll just read it as it is. I love the idea of these surfers who struck out into the unknown, suffered torments, and finally arrived at their own visions of heaven. They would up and vanish one day, then stumble back into town 6 months later, sunburned, malarial, missing teeth, a stone lighter, but with a light in their eyes that spoke of waves beyond my dreams. This is why we travel, for waves. I'm reminded with that of the juxtaposition that you used in Java Ridge, where we had an asylum seeker boat and people whose very lives were at risk, and we had surfers there on a surf trip. What were you working on there? What was that juxtaposition about in your mind when you were writing it?
Well, it was about the developed and the developing worlds, and it was about privilege and how it blinds people to other people's suffering. And I think it emanated again from that trip to Madeira, because I remember this was 1999, and Madeira was a reasonably undiscovered surfing location at that stage. And there were these Californians there who were onto it and who had been there for a few seasons. And they were great fun, and they were very loud, and there was a lot of drinking and carrying on and joking. And but it was essentially a rural community, and there were people with little farming pens on the cliffs, and there were orchards, and they lived in villages almost in a subsistence way. And there was one particular day when we'd probably gone too far, and this woman absolutely read the riot act at us, and she said, "You understand that our men have died out there for hundreds of years. It's not a playground. It's not your place to come here and treat it like it's fun. It's deadly serious. We're a fishing community." Essentially told us off. And I remember being really struck by that, A, that she was absolutely dead right, we'd been insensitive, but B, that two different groups of people can look at the same body of water in an entirely different way. And so I wanted the meeting of the two boats in Java Ridge to occur on the same piece of reef. So the Australian surfers have surfed it in the afternoon, and then a big storm's come in and the swells come up and it's gone onshore, and then an asylum seeker boat is wrecked on that same piece of coral, to kind of metaphorically make the point that one person's paradise is another person's hell. And from there you can branch right out into these notions about privilege and lack of privilege, and developing and developed, and all of those contrasts.
Yeah. It's really interesting, that quote from Nick Carroll that Madeline's put up. It does bring to mind for me one of the very first surf trips, international surf trips that I did, and that was to Sri Lanka which I'm thinking was the early 80s. And to Aragon Bay, quite remote on the east coast. But there were people there who were surfing. And it was a fishing village. Aragon Bay was a fishing village at that time, and the boats would put out to sea every day, and more often than not they'd come back virtually empty. So it was subsistence living, and yet here we were there. We had come here to do this very Western thing, which was to surf, enjoy our time in the water, while these fishing boats were heading out each morning. We'd be having our roti on the beach and paying for it, and our coffee. But there were also people there who there were talking about the wasting of these. Some of these people had been there for a long period of time, Westerners, a couple of whom had fought in Vietnam and never gone home. And they were wrecks. They were wrecks. They'd been there too long. They had coral ulcers that were like, their bodies were just had holes in them, and yet they'd still paddle out every day. And in the end, reflecting on all of that, I had some great waves there, but I wasn't sad to leave. It was like there was something that made me feel very uncomfortable about being there. As much as I had a good time and I really enjoyed myself, there was something about the sort of juxtaposition that you talk about with Java Ridge that occurred at that point. And I, like I said, in the end, I was probably reasonably happy to be leaving.
You remind me of there was a surf film, excuse me, a few years ago. I think it was Deer and Yonder, where one of the things they did was they were chasing down this guy in San Diego, who apparently had surfed every day for some extraordinary period of time, like 20 years, every single day he got in the water and surfed. And they wanted to find this guy, I think in the assumption that he would have found some state of spiritual nirvana. And they tracked him down in a car park getting into his wetsuit, and they interviewed him, and he essentially said, "Make it stop. I'm not enjoying it. I haven't enjoyed it for years." He was just completely compulsive.
Yeah.
If you go back to the Garden of Eden thing of Steve Cooney and Peter Troy and people like that in Indonesia, and what they found and what they opened up to Australians as pioneers. And if you now look at the state of Kuta, we have a very, very large responsibility as a culture for what we did to that place.
Mm.
And in one sense, we've lifted people out of poverty and we've given them businesses and all that stuff. Yeah. In another sense, we've taken them out of their traditional cultural practices, agricultural practices, and we've despoiled the place. We've polluted it. And really, so much of that, I know that it's every country in the world now that goes to Bali, but a lot of it comes back to us and surfing and a handful of Australians who couldn't possibly see the consequences of what they were launching.
Yeah, which is probably universal sort of story of travel in developing countries, regardless of whether you're a surfer or not, and that guilt, which I think is quite natural to feel, and we should feel when we do go there and we affect that culture in the way that we do.
Yeah, you're right.
I think we are just about out of time. So I would like to thank everybody for having come along. I'm sure Vic is going to do this as well and put a couple of adverts. But thanks very much, Jock. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. I hope it was illuminating, and I'm sure Vic is going to give a really good little ad for Lines to the Horizon now as well.
Hey, and Vic, just before you do, there was one more I'd made a note to mention, and I didn't get to it, but Emily Brugman, who is in Lines to the Horizon as well, has got her debut novel coming out in, I think, March, and it's called The Islands. And I've just read it. It's about the Hootman Abrolhos, if anybody, or there's lots of people, I think, on this Zoom who are West Australians and who love that coast. And it was a stunningly good novel. So when it comes out, I'd recommend having a look at it.
I'll make sure the library gets some copies of that.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jock. You have really instilled in me the romance of surfing, and I thank you for that.
Thanks, Vic.
Just let you know that we do actually have copies of Lines to the Horizon in the library, and we've also spoken to Torquay Books. You'll be getting copies in, and I think the link to Torquay Books for you to order online is going in the chat as we speak. Also, I just want to let you know that I've created a bibliography of surf writing, which I'm hoping to email out to you all. It includes Gidget, Barbarian Days, and it includes Spot to Go Surfing and On the Jungle Ridge. So keep your eye out for that. I'll send that through.
I'm in good company.
Look, on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library, I want to thank you all for joining us, and good reading and good surfing. Thank you.
Thanks, Vic.
Thank you.
Cheers, Mark.
Cheers.